At some point on December 31st in the year 2000, a man left a house in a suburb of Tokyo, Japan, leaving behind his fingerprints, DNA, a sweater, and a house full of victims. From the outside looking in, the house looked like almost every other house in any typical Japanese suburb. It had 2 stories, was in a good neighbourhood, and had a park right on the other side of the back fence. But the inside of the house was quite different to most others. The property had actually been split into separate apartments, meaning that 2 families were living on different floors with no way to enter each other's apartment from the inside of the house. If one of them wanted to do that, they would have to go outside and either up or down the stairs, depending on whose front door they wanted to get to. But that didn't mean that these 2 neighbours weren't close to each other. In fact, they were very, very close. Upstairs was the Miyazawa family, a family of 4. Mikio Miyazawa was a 44-year-old businessman whose colleagues would later describe him as the kind of guy that got on well with everyone, and he was married to Yasuko. Yasuko was a 41-year-old teacher in one of the local schools, and she was known to have been kind, compassionate, and full of love for the couple's 2 children. First, there was Nina, an 8-year-old who was everything that an 8-year-old girl usually is. She was full of life and energy, and she adored football and ballet, and never stopped moving for a minute. And then there was her younger brother, Ray. Ray was only 6 years old and really only just stepping in to enjoying life to the fullest when his parents noticed something odd. Ray was showing signs of having a speech impediment, and the Miyazawas had been taking him to treatment over the recent months, hoping to improve things for him. There was plenty of time for things to improve, and the Miyazawas had the support of their close neighbours, Yasuko's mother and brothers, who all lived in the flat beneath the Miyazawas. On the same road were only 2 other sets of neighbours, but it hadn't always been like that. When the Miyazawas had first moved in, there had been almost 200 neighbours living in the area, but most of that had changed over the last few years. It all goes back to the park right on the other side of the Miyazawa's fence. Plans had been made to approve and expand the park, and many of the neighbours in the neighbourhood had already moved out as part of the plan to make space for the expansion. In fact, the Miyazawas would also be moving out in a short time, but as fate would have it, things would go far differently for them. Sometime between 11:30 p.m. and 5 minutes past midnight on December 30th to 31st, a man climbed up one of the trees in the park right beside the Miyazawa's household. The branches of the tree took him right up to the bathroom window, and after he'd got the screen off the window, he slipped into the property. The first bedroom he came upon was little Ray's. The boy was sleeping, but that didn't stop the intruder from creeping up to the boy's bed and using his bare hands to strangle him. Ray couldn't have put up much of a fight, but he did manage to alert his father, Mikio, who heard something happening in Ray's room. He went running down the hallway and burst into his son's room, only to find the killer strangling Mikio's now dead son. Mikio threw himself at the killer, but the man was armed. The killer had a rather unusual weapon on him, a fishing knife that later investigators were able to pinpoint not because of the wounds the man had inflicted on Mikio, but through something else that he had left behind. As the 2 men struggled in Ray's room, the killer got the upper hand and stabbed Mikio in the head, his knife going in deep enough to take life from Mikio as he fought to protect his family. The killer pulled the knife out, probably knowing that there were still other people in the house, but the knife got fractured, leaving behind a shard in Mikio's wounds, which investigators found later on. From there, it's unclear if he went to Yasuko or her 8-year-old daughter Nina first, but it is clear that the killer used the broken knife to attack both of them before he went to the kitchen, got a fresh knife, and finished killing the entire Miyazawa family. It wasn't until around 10 a.m. the following day when Yasuko's mother, Haruko, entered the apartment after not being able to reach anyone upstairs for a few hours, and that the exact scale of what had happened the night before was discovered. Most people would suspect that after killing an entire family in the middle of the night, the killer would have gone there to take advantage of the situation and collect and steal valuables before disappearing into the night. But this killer was different. He did undoubtedly take advantage of the situation, but not necessarily in the ways some may think. The killer took his time. He treated his own wounds with a first aid kit in the house, took a nap on the sofa, and then got hungry. He went to the kitchen, eating a whole melon and some ice cream, and drank 4 bottles of tea before the inevitable happened. He went to their bathroom, using their toilet, and not even bothering to flush when he was finished. There's something cold and particularly callous about this act after killing an entire family. But perhaps now that he was rested and had had something to eat or drink, the killer could get to work. Logs onto the computer shows that he'd spent time browsing the internet and drawers through the house had been ransacked. Some money was taken and paperwork had been left strewn around the house, some of it in the bathtub and in the toilet, and others just across the floor. Exactly what the killer did after that is a mystery, but it is clear that at some point he reorganised his things and decided to leave some of them behind. On the very same sofa that he'd slept during the night, the killer left behind a knife, a muffler, a bag, a sweater, jacket, hat, gloves, shoes, and 2 handkerchiefs, and then he seemed to just disappear without a trace. But chillingly, it is possible that he stayed in the household most of the night, only leaving just before Yasuko's mother arrived. Haruko entered the home around 10:40, but the investigators found evidence of computer activity happening in the Miyazawa household at 10 a.m. Was it possible that Haruko had only missed the killer by a couple of minutes? What would have happened if she had caught him? Would she have seen a glimpse of the man who'd taken her daughter and grandchildren away from her, or would she have been another victim? It is difficult to say, especially since investigators have also come out and said that it was entirely possible that the last piece of activity on the computer could have come from Haruko herself. They argue that she may have accidentally moved the mouse while discovering the crime scene, and so far authorities have left it to speculation, not coming out either way to say what really happened. The last time the authorities officially put the killer in the household was when he'd used the computer after killing the family, meaning there is about an 8-hour gap between the 2 sets of computer activity. But who was the killer, and why did he do this? No one knew the answers to that, but the authorities were determined to find out, and they had a long list of physical evidence to help point them towards the killer. As stated previously, the killer left his fingerprints, DNA, and a sweater behind. The prints didn't match any in the Japanese databases, and neither did the DNA, but the DNA could tell the investigators a bit more about him. They knew his blood type, and they knew that his father was possibly from East Asia, maybe Korea, and his mother was possibly European, or she at least had some European DNA in her ancestry. This should have helped the authorities narrow down the list of suspects, but almost unbelievably it got them nowhere. It proved that the killer might have had some connection to other countries outside of Japan, but not what he was doing in Japan or if he'd purposefully targeted the Miyazawas. And then things got even more puzzling. Inside the bag that the killer had left behind, the investigators found sand, something that could have helped them pinpoint where the killer might have gone, and hopefully in the more recent days before the murders, but what the investigators did find only raised far more questions. They were able to track down where the sand had originally come from, all the way down to a very specific piece of land, just not a piece of land in Japan. The sand had come from an Air Force base all the way out in the Nevada desert in California, USA, but how it had ended up in a bag in Japan in a house where 4 people had been murdered was a complete mystery. The theory was raised that the killer was someone in the military, possibly American and stationed either in Japan or possibly Korea, but maybe the killer had just stolen the bag or bought it second hand and the investigators were onto nothing. Maybe the killer had only been related to someone in the military, and the investigations were chasing up a dead end. Not wanting to leave any stone unturned, the investigators went back to the sweater. Only 130 of these sweaters had ever been made and sold, and that was a far shorter list of potential suspects than the DNA evidence had provided the investigators with. If they could track down the people who'd bought this sweater, find someone from that shortlist with the same family background who may or may not have connections with the American military, they'd finally be onto something concrete. But the investigation unfortunately dragged on. Only about 20 of the sweaters and the people who bought them were ever tracked down, and the others still remain unknown. Throughout the years, over 246,000 investigators have collected almost 13,000 pieces of evidence, conducting an almost unimaginable number of interviews and requesting help from international agencies, all ending in nothing but a cold case. 15 years later, the authorities announced a 20 million yen, or about $155,000 reward for anyone who can provide information that leads to them discovering and convicting the killer. But that wasn't all. The authorities also announced that 40 officers were still officially working on the case full-time, and that hasn't really changed. The last formal announcement regarding the Miyazawas came in 2019 when the authorities announced that the reward still stands and that 35 officers are still assigned to the case. The Miyazawa house also still stands, untouched and unoccupied for the 23 long years that the remaining members of both sides of the family have been left without answers. But perhaps one day the case will close. The house can be given a new lease of life, and a community can move on from the brutal and tragic things that took place in an unusually quiet and peaceful Japanese neighbourhood.